This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 176. Free broadband. Corbyn's bad connection.
Hello again, welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and here in the UK, we are in the midst of election fever. It's a fever because you don't want it, it gives you a headache, and you just hope it's going to be over soon. But to win us over, and to stop us talking about Brexit, politicians are promising the world tax cuts, more police officers, free childcare, more money for schools, new hospitals, and that's just the Tories. Meanwhile, Labour is pledging free high-speed broadband for everyone. So today, we're going to look at the idea, not just of broadband, but also the idea that governments can spend more money if they want to. And the fact that they can, does that mean they should? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Now, as a side note, before we do start to talk about broadband, one of Sajid Javid's proposals is to abolish inheritance tax, which is a complete turnaround for the Tories from the last election, because then they were proposing that old people in nursing homes should use some of their money that will be inheritance. They should sell their family property to cover their care in the nursing home. So in other words, digging into their children's inheritance. And that didn't go down well. So now abolishing inheritance tax, which applies to currently any money you inherit over £325,000. That sounds like getting rid of a tax on the rich, doesn't it? Even if it's applied after they've died. That's passing wealth from one generation to another without any tax whatsoever. Passing money from the rich onto the youngsters who are going to continue to be rich, passing it on from one generation to the next, something which Britain is terribly good at. But enough on that. What about broadband? Boris Johnson is calling it communist broadband, the pledge by the UK Labour Party that if they are elected, they're going to deliver free high-speed broadband to everyone by 2030. But it's just one of many election pledges from both sides of the political spectrum, all offering us more than we have now without paying any more taxes. In fact, Boris is saying he wants to spend more and cut taxes. So, Steve, I mean, you could argue that this is all fine, couldn't you? Because with modern monetary theory, governments can spend more, go into a budget deficit, pay for it with money created by the central bank, and you could keep on doing that, theoretically, till inflation becomes a problem. But as this is demonstrating, the fact that you can do it, I mean, where is the discipline in all of this? You could just keep on coming up with crazy ideas till the cows come home.
Well, that's the one thing. Of course, neither side of this election campaign is putting its flag up on MM&T.
No.
So we have this.
They're all saying it's going to be paid for somehow. Absolutely.
They all think both sides are saying you've got a tax to cover it, and they're both giving their taxation plan. So, in a political sense, MMT is not part of this particular election. The issue of discipline is important. And it applies on twofold, not just on how the government spends the money. I mean, one obvious example of MMT is the American military occupation around the planet. Mm. Okay, that's all paid for with American dollars. They can generate an unlimited amount of it. The scale of the American defence budget is something of the order of I'm not sure. It'd be one fun one to look up for you on another future topic, but it's at least 10% of government spending, I think, and a substantial part of the economy. And nobody ever asks how do we get money for that next nuclear missile or that next cruise missile. It's just appropriated without argument, and that seems to be a trend globally.
But they would still be trying to pay for that out of taxes, wouldn't they, in the United States? I mean, they are.
Well, no, they claim it again. This is what. Let's look. I hate to bring it back to this, mate. I really do. But let's look at the empirical data.
And you want to talk facts?
I want to talk facts. Yeah,
that is what is.
I'll be careful. I'll even get my facts from the White House. If you go search for White House data on the web, you will find an excellent store of a range of extra sources of data, in particular the United States surplus. Since last time I checked, it was 1900, but it's called Historical Tables at the White House. And if you go there, you'll see summary of receipts, outputs and surplus and deficits, 1789 to 2024. And then as percentage of GDP, 1930 to to 2024. 2024 obviously being the end of the next budget period. I've taken data from the first table and divided by GDP to get a series from 1900 till now, which is 120 years long. And I think just maybe, an economist might agree that 120 years is close to the long run. Okay.
You can take a trend from that, I think. Yeah.
The average surplus for the last 120 years has been minus 2.4% of GDP. If you take out funding the world wars, which of course were enormous, the deficit hit as much as 30% of GDP in 1 year, it's about 2.2%. So in other words, for 120 years, the American government
has been getting further and further into debt. In that case,
no, the government's been financing itself quite effectively. This has been the American century,
right?
And if you believe all the people that say you've got to have hard money,
right?
The past century, the American century, got to have hard money. Everything will all be ruined if we have fiat currencies that don't maintain their value, et cetera, et cetera. During that period, America became the world's superpower, and at the end of it is still the world's superpower. I think it's going to lose that status sometime in the 22nd century. Actually, sorry, the
you
21st
think we have to wait that long? Yeah.
No, this century.
Sometime in the next couple of decades, I would have thought.
Yeah, I reckon it's going to lose its status, but it hasn't for the whole period that it was running a deficit on average of 2.2% of GDP, excluding wars.
Right.
So, in other words, it's quite sustainable to run that deficit. People say it can't be do it. We'll all be ruined. Yeah.
But how are they managing those numbers? Because if that's happening every year and it's been going for 120 years, then surely the accumulated deficit for how they're accounting for their budget would be absolutely enormous. Now, I know it is enormous. Is that what's been happening? It's just been creeping up year by year.
It's running, the accumulated debt now is running at about 100% of GDP. It was down about 60% before the financial crisis. So I just realized I can actually use this new data to get figures for the American surplus as a percentage of GDP right back to 1789. So I'll do that after we finish chatting. But it can run this indefinitely, and that's the point of MMT. So long as your currency is accepted in its political realm, you can run a deficit of any scale. It's a question of what that scale does to your economy. Yeah. Now, one of my rules of thumb is that the amount of money the government should create every year should be roughly equal to nominal GDP growth divided by the velocity of circulation of money. And lo and behold, that comes out at about 2.5% of GDP.
Right. So...
Okay? Because
there is some fiscal control. I mean,
you've had this. Every government, for the last 120 years, has sworn they're going to get the country back to surplus. Now, the two governments that managed to do that were the governments in America in the 1920s, and they were saving for a rainy day. The rainy day, of course, they knew they were going to have, called the Great Depression. They ran a surplus of 1% of GDP every year for pretty much the whole of the 1920s. That was a major causal factor behind the Great Depression because, and this is the point of MMT, when you run a surplus, somebody else is running an identical deficit. Yeah. If the government's getting a surplus of 1% of GDP, the rest of the society is getting minus 1% of GDP.
And do you know what? Even if you were to, and this is, I know this annoys you as much as it annoys me, the idea that, people talk about the economy being run like a household budget. If you were to run that analogy, people generally spend more than they actually bring in as well. People,
credit is part of overall expenditure. The question is, don't let credit get out of hand, and what we're talking about is don't let government spending get out of hand. Yeah. But we should get back to the point, Matt. In that sense, I think, this is a discussion for another point. The real thing is this broadband issue because...
Yeah. Well, because I wanted to just lay the foundation behind that because is it? Because then you get to the question: if you've got a big project like this, how can you say, and you're going to allocate government money, however it's funded, how can you say whether this is a good idea or not?
Well, I think there are some technologies which are pretty bloody obviously a good idea. And for example, I think putting bitumen on the ground when you get building cars as a transportation system makes eminent sense. Yeah. I highly recommend this. One of my favorite. One of the very few movie series that never disappointed at any stage was Back to the Future. I bought all three and watched them again just recently. And when Marty in episode 3 blasts off in the DeLorean to head back to the 1880s, I think it is, to rescue his future, he comes off the. I think he's actually driving inside a drive-in cinema. Remember those?
Yeah.
And he's accelerating towards the screen and gets on the other side, he's on rough country. So the state laid out those roads, and actually a large part of it occurred during the 1930s with the building of the interstate highway system in the United States. So if you know people are needing a technology, then there's sometimes you should provide it as soon as possible. And the question is it better done by private interests or is it better done by the state? And broadband, I think, is just like the road system, is an eminently useful example of that because... Yeah.
Do you know what? We might differ on this, and it's a complex argument. But because there's so many different levels to what is broadband, and then the question about should it be free, and there's different speeds of broadband, obviously. But it's not like building a road from the beginning and putting bitumen on. In that a lot of people already do have a broadband connection. The fact is, some people, and that has been provided largely, in more recent years by the private sector.
Yeah,
but there are areas where the private sector doesn't want to go, and that's the issue. So then you get to the question of
that's like Australia versus the UK is an interesting example there, because there's large parts of Australia that commercial people would never want to bother going because the cost of the infrastructure overwhelms any potential for profit. And the question is, do you want to have areas of your country where you can't get any internet reception? And the answer is, you don't take a holiday in the parts of the country where you can't get reception.
Well, yeah, and we're talking about fixed line rather than mobile. But mobiles, because he's talking, the Labour approach is on fixed broadband, and maybe they should be looking at mobile as well.
Yeah,
but the question is on speed. It's speed and ubiquity, isn't it? They're the two factors. So if you look at 24 megabits per second, which you might say is not very fast, but it's actually, for large parts of the world, that's pretty good. Over 95% of the British population now has speeds, what is classified as super fast broadband, 24 megabits per second plus. That basically means it's the technology is almost certainly going to be fibre to the cabinet. So you have those green boxes at the end of your street, and depending on how far you are away from it, that'll determine the speed, because the last bit into your home is copper. And very often it's a lot more than 24. It could be 60 or 65 megabits per second. So 95% of the population has access to that right now. Most of that, 76% of that came from commercial rollouts. And then there was £1.6 billion of the broadband delivery programme, which boosted that up from 76 to 95%. So government money was put in to help commercial money. But that only got to 95%. Then they're stuck because, the rest of it is difficult to do. So you need satellite, or you need to use other technologies, or it's just too expensive. And then you've got the question, is 24 or even 65 fast enough, and do you want to go to the next level? So I'm sort of thinking that, we've got quite a way in the UK with commercial operators doing it. And the national broadband network in Australia, even though the idea behind it might have been quite good, has obviously been very expensive and hasn't really boosted speeds a great deal. In fact, it's been a disaster.
That's a classic case of political interference from people we both know. Okay, Malcolm Turnbull and bloody Tony Abbott, who completely stuffed that over. So, this is a good general point, because the issue comes down to, in my opinion, whether the overall rollout is something which will work with the private sector alone, and what the costs of the competition side of the private sector are, because people often don't factor in the marketing side. They assume the typical neoclassical idea there's no marketing necessary because everybody knows everything. Garbage. The firms put an enormous amount of money into marketing, and that then becomes part of the base price you've got to pay to even get the service in the very first place. So if you were starting with a virgin field, and there were no large rival private systems on the horizon that could do the job as well or better, then I wouldn't bias in favour of the state rolling it out. But the case is, at the moment, that's probably no longer true about broadband, a couple of reasons. But I'll give you my favourite example of the free, not whether the free provision of broadband, but it was a compulsory provision of T100. Can you explain what a T100 standard is to the listeners?
Well, it's just a fat pipe is what they call it in the industry, isn't it? So it's just a very fast connection. So it's like a
100
gigabit.
megabits a second minimum, I think, is the speed. Okay. I had this is one of my funny
in
little,
each direction as well. That's the other thing. So it's
bi-directional, So the rapid speed, no different than download speed. I had a member of the ex-president, I think he was at the time, of the Communist Party of South Korea, decided to come out and spend a sabbatical with me. That was one strange experience, let me tell you. But anyway, when he first arrived, he didn't like where I first chose. It was too expensive, so I had to find somewhere else to rent a flat for him, and he wasn't very happy with that one either. But anyway, the first thing he did, he got his laptop out, plugged in an Ethernet cable, and started walking around the walls trying to find a place to plug the Ethernet cable in. And I finally had to say, "Excuse me, what are you looking for?" And he said, "Internet connection." And I said, "Well, we don't have Ethernet here." He said, "What?
Yeah.
You don't have Ethernet?" It turned out that the South Korean government, not the North Korean, the South Korean government had somehow, I'd love to check the history of this, told the telecommunications companies, the nascent ones in South Korea, that they didn't care how it was done, but they had to make sure every home in the country had a T100 connection. Now, I sort of think that had some sort of role in developing the evolution of Samsung. Okay, Korea has really rocketed ahead in the last 20 years with that technology.
Well, if you look at average speed, so in the UK, the average speed of a broadband connection is 64 megabits per second. It's not, there are worse places in the world. Australia. But which is still, even, that's the crazy thing. Even with the national broadband network rollout, Australia is still well down the list. But Singapore, South Korea, as you mentioned, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the US, France, all well over double what we have in the UK. Even Spain has an average speed of 118 megabits per second. So what's happened in the UK is it's stalled. And it is because it's being done by the private sector, but I don't think it means the public sector necessarily needs to step in. Because what's happened is you've got one dominant player in BT with the Openreach division that has rolled out these fibre to the cabinet connections, which are good enough for most people, and they are just sweating the asset. Why would you build on top of that? Why would you extend the fibre connection?
That's the same sort of thing with the railways in the UK. I mean, I've just gone to a couple more railway trips in the UK in the last few weeks, and oh my God! I mean, if I want to go to a museum, I want to know that I'm going to a museum. The train pieces, the carriages, everything is just so primitive across most of the UK, because once you privatise the railroads, rather than improving the surface, you sit on the asset and milk it for what it's worth. Yeah. And these carriages, and
even worse. Why would you invest if you're in a franchise which has only got that franchise for a certain number of years before it gets re-advertised?
It's all insanely badly done. So this is where ideology gets in the way massively. And of course, ideology is what screwed up the Australian rollout. South Korea was very pragmatic. We just want everybody to have this newest connection. You do it. There's problems. Obviously, there was been government funding involved as well for the organisation, but quite possibly they were funded to do it according to the government rules. But for example, in Australia, you might remember back with the rollout of cable TV. Yeah. What did the bloody hawk government do at the time? They wanted to have competition for the rollout. So what did we have? Two companies. Yeah.
Going down the same streets. This is like your analogy about ice cream vendors on a beach being next to each other. Exactly the same thing happened. They rolled out everywhere together because they didn't want to give the other one a monopoly in their own area. So they went out. Yeah,
but on top of that, they also did not roll out other areas, which, I mean, my then wife had a good friend who lived over in the Hills districts of Sydney, 5-acre properties everywhere, very wealthy people. Did they roll out the cable there? No, because they were 5-acre properties. Yeah,
it was too expensive.
So we had 2 sets of cables running in our house around our street in Marrickville, and 0 at our friend's place in the Hills district.
So here's the thing. So then, doesn't it make sense? Because there's different ways you can subsidise the provision of a service, isn't there? One is you can subsidise. Well, 3 ways really. One is you just say, well, the government's going to do it. But as we've been discussing, maybe the horse has already bolted on that, and it becomes too problematic. The other way is to say, well, okay, let's let the commercial sector do it, and we'll subsidise them. But then you hit the question of, well, who do we subsidise? If there's competing players, who do we give the money to? And the danger is it normally goes to the largest one, which is Telstra in the case of, or was Telstra in the case of Australia, and BT in the UK. Or you say, well, no, let's open it up to whoever wants to do it, and the consumer gets the subsidy, and they pay to the company that connects. And that last one seems like the most fair.
But even there, you get the same nonsense again. Like mobile phone towers are clustered where there's the most mobile phone users. You'll have multiple mobile towers going up. I don't know the technology completely, but I would not be amazed to find one of those towers could service everybody, and you could distribute the towers more equally throughout the country to have a broader system. So there are real tricks, and using in what's the best way to provide any publicly accessible network good. And this is the important thing about roads, internet, and so on. They are network gods. The first telephone was useless. Okay, the telephone became valuable when more people connected to the telephone network. Yep. So you had a network effect, which was therefore in the interest of you could never, if you charge every person for the cost of giving every other person a telephone so that they could speak to you, we wouldn't have telephones.
So do you then say, okay, well, we want to reach other parts of the country with broadband, and we've got maybe a few providers, and there's not just the big players, the smaller players as well. So how does the government deal with that? Do they say, well, okay, we will subsidise you to roll out to these areas if you undergo these, here's the stipulations, and then companies pitch, I guess, and somebody in the government then has to decide who that money's going to go to.
I mean, internet technology is something we should have been talking about pretty much 20 years ago, which is when the Koreans were doing it. I mean, this guy who came out to visit me, I'm talking definitely pre-1990, between 1996 and 1999. Okay, so I'm talking at least 20 years ago that the South Koreans did this. Now, if you wait 20 years, then private sector technology can catch up with the public sector. And that is what's happening with telecommunications. This is one thing I'd like to discuss with you, because you know more about this technology than I do. Musk is putting up that set of, I've forgotten what he's calling his satellites, but he intends having 30,000 internet satellites in orbit around the planet by about 2025.
Right.
And at that point, I mean, I'm not sure how far.
Which is fine, which is good for geographic coverage, but obviously a pretty lousy service, even low orbit satellites. You've still got the delay of sending the signal up and bouncing back, so you get very, very high latency compared to.
But if you have 30,000 of them, I mean, 30,000 would mean there's going to be one above you. If there's not one above you now, wait a couple of seconds, it'll be there. Right. So,
I'm not sure we'll be able to hold the sort of conversation that we're holding now, though, without painful delays. And as you know, it's latency, which is always the problem.
Well, that's where cable makes so much sense. Like optical fibre makes so much sense, because it's highly unlikely we'll ever find a system for bulk transmission of data which is faster than optical fibre. I know some instances where high-frequency trading firms have been pulling out optical fibre and putting in radio between themselves.
And so line of sight, because
and because it's twice as the speed of light is twice as far. But you can't have radio everywhere, so the only mass solution is optical fibre. So maybe that will be the case, but we're getting to the point where, with remote regions, you may just say, look, let's subsidise people's cost for a couple of years, or let the rollout happen slowly, because the technology has caught up.
But you are a firm believer, aren't you, in things like this, that they should be managed by the government sector, by the public sector?
Oh no, it comes down to the how much of a network effect are we looking at, and what are the cost leading aspects of it. If for example, I'm obviously a great fan of the space race. I now would not want to see NASA getting all that involved, because private companies have shown that they've absorbed the technology the government laid the foundations for, and they're now doing it better and faster.
Because Jeremy Corbyn's plan, though, is to in effect nationalise Openreach, that part of the network arm of BT, and saying, well, then you hit all the same problems that you had with the national broadband network in Australia, where you then say, well, okay, what about the network that already exists? Well, the government is going to have to buy that network from the incumbent, and then what about all the other people who've got networks which are now isolated because you've come in and you're providing government-sponsored competition? That you then get to the stage where you have to say, well, okay, we're going to have to offer you some sort of compensation, and then the other way, what happens if your cost of providing the service is undercut by other providers because they're only doing the low-hanging fruit and you've got to do the expensive stuff? There's a million and one questions which have all been tackled by the NBN. I don't know as the NBN, as it turned out, the original idea might have been good, but at the end of it, Australia is left with some of the most expensive broadband in the world. And an average speed, I've got it here, just hang on one second, 42 megabits per second, 12 years after the NBN was started.
I knew there'd be a link with Douglas Adams somewhere in this conversation.
That's right. The answer to everything, 42. It's the 64th fastest in the world, and God knows how many tens of billions of dollars.
Well, I blame all that on Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, because I know the original plan was optical fibre to the premise.
Yeah.
And bloody Abbott insisted that Turnbull sabotaged the plan somehow by putting forward something that they could say was cheaper.
Well, actually, what they've got is pretty much what Britain's got now. So what they're spending a lot of money on is delivering what the commercial sector has delivered in the UK.
Yeah, and if the state sector had done it, you have what happens in South Korea, where you plug yourself into a T100, 100 megabits per second both ways or faster. So, I think this is the sort of thing which should have been done in the first instance by the state.
The fact that it hasn't, though, is it a sensible plan? What Jeremy Corbyn is now saying, does it make sense, or is it?
I'm now ambivalent. I mean, I would like to know what the capabilities of the Starlink, it's the name of Musk's satellite system, what the capabilities of that are going to be if you're going to get 100 megabits a second or faster out of that.
Yeah.
And maybe up to maybe.
Well, do you know what? There's the thing. You see, if you've got a big project and you roll it out, the goalpost, whether it's done by the private sector or by the public sector, the goalpost moves, with technology it can change. So there's other things. For example, one of the big problems with laying out fibre optic is that you've got to, and the stumbling block on any network has been, how do you connect it to people's homes? Who's actually going to dig up your petunias in the front garden, and are they going to put them back again? And that's the sort of stuff that annoys people, that you've got to dig trenches in people's homes. But but there are alternatives as well, like, for example, having mobile coverage, a very dense mobile network. So you have a lamppost in your street, you have a dish that goes into your home. You've probably got a Wi-Fi connection. You're probably using most of the devices over Wi-Fi anyway. So what's the difference between a Wi-Fi in your house versus a 5G mobile cell that is located right outside your house, giving you the capacity? Now, there's million and one technologies that could be available.
I've beaten you to the up research here. SpaceX has demonstrated speeds of 610 megabits per second using Starlink satellites with the US military. And the very first thing they say in their proposal is developing a low latency broadband internet system. So it may well be that this is one case where the original days where it had to be optical fibre to be high quality and high speed and low latency, those days are now passing. And we're in a point where a commercial organisation, which is SpaceX, is going to establish something which obviates the need to lay optical fibre.
But you need a lot of spectrum. If it was a lot of dense usage, you'd need a lot of spectrum, wouldn't you? You'd need to be able to cater for the gigabytes of stuff that we are now downloading to do that simultaneously.
I'm not sure. I mean, again, this is a technological issue, and it may well be these satellites are designed to have a transmission footprint with a particular frequency, and then transmit between themselves at other frequencies, and transmit down another location with a small frequency band.
So what we're saying, but what we're demonstrating here is that is it smart then to say, well, let's get a large government organisation to do all of this. Let's take OpenReach, which has been trying to organise itself, having been part of an incumbent provider for so many years, and take them back to where they were. Or is it better to let the private sector come in and?
My bias on this one is that given this particular private sector venture, which I have a fair bit of confidence in succeeding, I would say leave it to the private sector now and let us have satellite-based systems.
Yeah. And free. Not quite sure.
Not free. Not free.
This is the bizarre thing about all of this. Why should it be free when we're already paying? People who have it are already paying for it, and I don't see many people objecting, saying, "Oh, broadband's expensive."
Well, this is partly which again, I've checked this. It's interesting with the South Korean story, because part of the idea of making it free is to say, do what you want with it. Now, of course, lots of people are going to be downloading X-rated videos and gaming rigs. There's no doubt about that. But it may also be the state is underwriting the capacity for a private sector organisation to use that as a low cost part of their own infrastructure to develop an industry like Samsung has done over time. But it's also, it's partly the income distribution in this country sucks, as you know. The UK has got probably the most if not the most unequal income distribution on the planet, pretty damn close to it.
Well, I think the United States does better in that, doesn't it? They've taken income disparity to the next level. But the ubiquity thing here is important because it does. If you look at government services, for example, I mean, some people don't use government services online because they wouldn't know how to, because they're too old. But if you had broadband for everybody and part of it was free, then you would be able to say, well, okay, there's some government services which are online, but we also have to provide more expensive alternatives because not everybody's got access to online. If you had everybody with access to online services, then you could say, well, okay, that is the way we operate from now on, because we can, if we guaranteed that there will be a reasonable speed internet connection everywhere that's available for free, then let's have almost like a free government network. And then on top of that, you can say, by the way, if you want to go searching for porn or gaming, then you have to pay for that, and a commercial provider is going to provide that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, my issue is, again, about technology is, are you providing sufficient for what the future uses will be? Yeah. On that front, I mean, you and I both have great experience of the classic instance of that in Australia, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which was built, what was it? Is it 6 lanes or 8 lanes? I think it's 8 lanes, isn't it? 8 lane with two train lines, a pedestrian and a bicycle side, far beyond the capacity necessary in 1930, but pushed through by Bradfield is essential for the expansion of the city. When he was dead right. So often you've got to say, is what we are providing now sufficient for the future? Now, in that sense, the copper-based, cable to a node and copper to the household, no way is that sufficient. That is what the hassle with Australia. It's install an obsolete technology, copying what the UK already has. So at some point, I think that technology will have to be replaced. Now, do you replace it by actually putting in what was the original Australian proposal, which is broadband to the house, or do you say we gradually replace it with a satellite system which can reach the necessary speeds? Now, 600 megabits a second. We're talking megabits, aren't we? In both cases, 100 megabits versus bits versus bytes.
So megabits per second. Yeah. So I'm on about 70 at home. So you're talking about 600, did you say? Which would be
that's so 10 times the speed. Now, what is the obvious future need is going to be virtual conferencing or virtual meetings, because I think at some point, and this is where the global warming side of things come in, we're going to get to, for a substantial period of time, international travel will either be banned or too damn expensive for anybody except the ultra wealthy or the military or the government to undertake. So at that point, if you want to meet somebody overseas, you want to put on a pair of goggles and say, have a chat to them, and maybe tactile sensors where you can shake hands with them and so on and so forth. That requires a far higher speed than we have right now. And it may be that something like I don't know how the Starlink will work on that front, the speed and the latency, obviously the issues again, but that sort of need is there. And if you're telling me that 80 or 95% of the UK infrastructure currently uses optical plus copper, it's got to be replaced at some point.
And look, on that whole collaboration front, I mean, there's huge opportunities there which are very rarely talked about, which are clearly the direction. So I do a bit of video editing from time to time, and the idea that you could, there's just an example of somewhere where you've got specialist fields. So you might have somebody who's really good at opening title sequences, for example. You might have somebody who's really good at doing audio dubbing, and I might have somebody else who's better at getting the colors right, adjusting the colors, and then you might have somebody who's just does which is a bit like me, just doing the bog standard. Well, we're gonna splice it here, and and developing the story, and then you want to narrate it to voice over stuff. You could have a team of 5 or 6 people who could actually be simultaneously working on the same project, using the same file, which would take up a lot of bandwidth, but would get stuff done very quickly. And it could be people all over the world doing that. So I mean,
and a similar for mobile surgery, which has already been tested in some parts of Africa, I think, in India. So you want absolute high speed, you want absolute lack of latency for those. You don't want to have somebody moving a knife through however small the knife might be, through your innards, and there's a latency between them say stop and the knife actually stopping. So there are real issues about getting that correct.
Yeah,
and I think, as I said, this area, I think the private sector might finally have got the upper hand, and the UK really should be thinking not about laying it everywhere using optical fibre and making it all free in the current system, but getting ready perhaps to subsidise a movement to a satellite-based system which has the speed and latency covered.
Right, but if that's not commercially viable, then government money has to go into it. Then you get into the danger where the government is then saying, well, this money is for this technology, and that became the problem as you talked about in Australia, where the government said, well, okay, this is the technology. You've got politicians or civil servants determining how a technology is going to be rolled out, something which they've got no expertise in. They try and acquire it, but that's not their bread and butter. And that's the danger, isn't it? How do you determine? And again, which gets back to the original question, where if you've got no limitations on government money, and to the point where you've got too much money in supply, and then you get hit inflation problems. But up to that point, how do you determine what the money is used for when you're looking at things like this, which are not a decision you necessarily want the public sector to make?
Well, I want engineers making virtually every decision.
Yeah. And
on this front, I'd say, okay, what's the engineering answer right now? What is the best technology to go for? And only get the bean counters in after that if one technology is 10 times the cost of another. And unfortunately, we're given the bean counters first bracket this, and we get garbage systems like Australia has, and which apparently the UK has as well, which cannot grow, which cannot expand to the capacity that's necessary in the future. Now, that is a failure of politics, and it's actually the right-wing side of government that made that failure, not the left-wing. It was a conservative government in both cases who made those decisions.
Well, I think you can build on them.
It's a way to bash the Labor Party. It's something you can bash the Liberals, so-called Liberals in Australia, and the Tories in the UK for making the wrong technological choice.
So just on this question about public versus private then, if you look at the idea of renationalising BT's Open Reach division, they make £5.1 billion in revenue. So that's wholesale revenue. That is them providing their network to retail providers who then obviously pass on the service, add value and charge the customers. So that's what the Labour Party is saying should be given away for free, that 5.1 billion in revenue plus all those other revenues from retail providers. But here's the interesting thing. Openreach has got an EBITDA of almost 50%. So, which is quite...
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then of that other half, obviously that's before amortization. So there'll be the other half of that would include capital expenditure, you'd imagine would be a big chunk of that. But their annual capital expenditure is only 1.6 billion. So they make 5.1 billion in revenue and they invest 1.6 billion in capex in a company that's supposedly in a network rollout phase. That doesn't sound very much, does it?
It sounds like the same thing at the train lines. We've got a monopoly. We're going to rip off the public in the process and screw what the politicians say, which is what's fueling the anti-privatisation push. That's you can feel it in the UK these days because it's the country that's done the most to privatise, and rather than making everything better, it's made everything expensive and often more old-fashioned. Because why bother, updating the technology if you have the monopoly? It's the failure of applying cardboard cutout intersecting supply and demand curve analysis to complicated industries where those concepts don't apply in the very first instance.
So then when you look at those numbers, because that really is an example of sweating an asset, isn't it? That's like, we will invest the minimum to make it look like we're doing something to move the industry forward. But really, 5.1 billion in revenue, if that's a network arm, you'd be expecting that they would be having, 4.9 billion in capex, or something similar to that, where you've got some operational costs, obviously. But so then maybe then that becomes, if you look at that then becomes an argument to say, well, okay, if you're not going to behave, maybe we do need to renationalise you.
And that's what I think is a large part of the passion, because people are saying, look at these numbers, you're ripping us off. And this is, again, the cost of marketing, which once you have competition, you have marketing. And the cost of marketing can be as big as or greater than the cost of a bureaucracy. This is the thing which is left out in people when they make the comparisons, factoring, private provision versus government. They say, oh, look, private sector will do it more cheaply. Yeah, and it'll pay the managing director $30 million a year. It'll have a marketing budget twice as much as it puts into the actual infrastructure itself, et cetera, et cetera. And the competition doesn't work because the other bugger's doing exactly the same thing. So is one of these areas where I would just want to say, let's get an engineering costing of all this sort of stuff. work out this is a sort of network benefit that is far beyond the private benefit, and that applies to education, telecommunications, transport, health, then in that situation, it's either public provision or it's public financing of privates with incredible control over the expenditure and no marketing. You're a customer of the government in that case. You're providing. Given a government budget, you're doing the rollout. Sounds
to me like you're saying that we should have a plan.
We should think about technology. Yeah, what I'm sick of is 19th century textbooks being used to manage 21st century technology, and that's what's going on here. The supply and demand bullshit. Pardon me swearing on a family show, means that the mental virus that gets people's mind is always going to be better for the perfect. You have perfect competition in the private sector. You don't have perfect competition in anything. It's mathematically impossible to begin with, but even so in terms of the scale, a large number of industries are dominated by 4 major players. You're working in a world where there's market power to burn, and that market power comes with the marketing overheads and the internal expenses of a large profit-oriented bureaucracy with hierarchy inside, which absorbs a large amount of the cost as well. You're not necessarily going to do it more cheaply if you go from a public system to a private. It really comes down to what is more effective in getting it out there initially. Is it something with a huge network benefit, and the telecommunications and education and health? The answer is yes, overwhelmingly. There's a huge network effect. Let's provide the money publicly, but work out the best way to do it in terms of actually doing the installation and the upgrading. And on that front, with the railroad comparison, I think state provision wins hands down. All you have to do is compare privatised UK to the publicly owned European Union train lines.
I'm still getting over the idea that you think this is a family show. I'm just imagining mum, dad, and the 3 kids sitting around the fireside with the kids saying, "Oh, come on, let's just one more episode of the Debunking Economics podcast before it's time for bed. Time for bed. You must not have any more economics tonight."
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Good talk anyway, Steve. We'll catch you again next week.
Okay, mate. Bye.
December the 12th is the date of the election in the UK. How many more crazy ideas can they dream up? I think they just make them up the day before, perhaps the morning of the press conference. They decide something completely new. It'll all be over soon, thank God. That's it for the Debunking Economics podcast for today. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Back again next week. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.